webinar with the Platform for Liberty and Democracy. This is what we do every Sunday as we X-ray developments in and around the world, in Nigeria, in Africa as a continent, and of course around the world. Lend our voice to conversations and generally help to shape the narrative in terms of things going on all around. And that's why we're here again tonight, to do it as we do it as usual. Thank you for joining us. We do appreciate your taking our time to be part of this tonight. And tonight we're having a special guest in our midst who's been here with us a number of times before, and we're going at it again together with him. It's been the last time we had him, it was a very rich one, and we're discussing about languages, you know, the disappearance of native languages, you know, and it was so interesting also having the opportunity to exchange ideas with many top professors from across continents. You know, Dr. Kole Odutola always manages to do that somehow. You know, you just so tonight. This is a topic that is really very close to his heart and very close to our hearts as well, because when we do consider ages, we realize that there does appear to be a deficit somewhere in terms of there's that it's like a disappearing act, you know, across the continent of Africa, and we're more into a lot of other things nowadays, and the emphasis on knowledge and knowledge sharing, knowledge production, you know, knowledge transfer, knowledge consumption is actually, it's very minimal. It was Professor Patrice Lumumba I did talking about something along these lines. I think I watched the video on YouTube, and that was the day it actually brought home the import. You know, really how far we have gone with this, that Nigeria really does need to have a rethink. We have to cycle back and try to do things. But this will probably be the first time. Even Professor Lumumba's talk about this did not really go into the very deepest part of that topic. This is the first time I've seen anyone coin the topic in this way, because he was talking about, Professor Lumumba was talking about, you know, knowledge production in itself. But you know, what about it is one thing producing it, the knowledge is coming out of the factory, so to say. But then what about the consumption? Are the people ready for it? And, you know, what does Africa have to do? How do we push this? And ladies and gentlemen, tonight it is my pleasure to introduce this man, a man I would say I have so much time for, and someone I have so much respect for as well. And he's probably one of the easiest people to interact with. When you interact with him, he's just, you know, for me, it's always a pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, he's an associate instructional professor in Yoruba. Well, he was, you know, Yoruba PhD at Rutgers University, New Jersey, and currently he is a senior lecturer at the University of Florida. Please join me as I welcome Dr. Kole Odutola, our special guest for tonight. You're most welcome, sir. It's a pleasure having you in our midst.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to dive in straight into the presentation, and I already have the slide, and I'm going to just get on with it. Okay. Okay. So my title is knowledge production. Oh, sorry. Let's see. Okay. All right. My title is Knowledge Production and Consumption in Africa. And before I start, you know that I'm making a lot of assumptions here by pretending that I want to talk about the whole of the African continent. No, I do not have such competence, but I'm just locating it in a continent that we all know has a rich and vibrant intellectual tradition with a long history of knowledge production and consumption. However, the global landscape of knowledge production and dissemination has often marginalized African voices and perspectives. This section provides an overview of the current state of knowledge production and consumption on the African continent, highlighting both the challenges and the opportunities for advancing African scholarship and scholarship on Africa. You would have to bear with me because there are some of you who already know exactly what I'm going to talk about. You're used to it, you've heard it. And like the convener said, Professor PLO Lumumba of Kenya already talks a lot about this. And it is the question of what is knowledge? Who is producing it? Who is consuming it? Who determines what knowledge is? But before I go into that, because I have included, as it were, Africa in the title, and I have had the pleasure of attending 2 conferences before this one. And during my reflection, I came up with, when Africa is mentioned at conferences, or when you attend any conference with Africa as the main topic or the theme, I would ask you to do a few self-interrogation. Number one, is the conference you're attending a funeral for the continent? What are you likely to notice in the tone of presentations? If not a funeral, it could as well be a wake-keeping ceremony where presenters talk about the past with so much nostalgia. At other times, and very rarely, the conference could be a very celebratory mode, in a very celebratory mode. Here you're bound to hear presenters talk about Africa's attempt at doing this and doing that. They will tell you about Pesa in Kenya, remind you of how Afrobeats conquered the airwaves, and throw in the great literature of pre-atrocities period. The pre-atrocities period is, I'm adopting that from what people call pre-colonial and post-colonial. But Yvonne, the Kenyan writer, has advised us that when we clothe that period in a word like colonialism, it's like spraying cologne on a word that is horrible, that is terrible, despicable. But if we go right to the heart of it, what was it? It was a period of atrocities. Let us call it so. So you would have them talk about what they call the pre-colonial, but we will stick to pre-atrocities and the atrocities they committed and remind them in Belgium of what the King of Belgium did, cutting off the hands of people who could not meet their target. We seem to forget those and simply just deodorize it. There are also times when bards were historians of their communities, and they were brought up in such conferences. Even mention will be made of Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, Nelson Mandela of South Africa, or Northern African thinkers, which we rarely hear about, because most of their productions are either in French or Arabic. And then, as an addendum, you get to hear of women of note, Funlayo Ransom Kuti, the woman who led the Aba riot, Bassey Ekpo, and sometimes they would mention the women fighters in Dahomey and the rest. So these are what the West thinks celebrates the African continent. Finally, the conferences could be about the unfortunate marriage of a continent to various brutal warriors. Here, the political scientists, the ethnographers, the anthropologists, and art historians come out with their long knives to dissect the life of Africa, past or present. So, my question to you before we set on this trail is, which type of conference have you attended recently? Do they talk about Africa's own type of science? Is anybody bothered about the role of Africa in artificial intelligence? Is anybody talking about the role of Africa in space? Is anybody talking about the role of the continent in nanotechnology? Or these are just things for the West? Do they remind the world about the Magna Charta of the 13th century and such non-morbid recollections? Now that I have mentioned Magna Charta, the question is, what is the Magna Charta anyway? I have a little story to tell you. I was fortunate to invite the executive director of Trust Africa, Dr. Brima Sao, to my class. And he just dropped it offhandedly, about the Magna Charta, how it was put together in the 13th century, 50 years before the Magna Carta. And he looked at the students like, oh, I'm sure you already know about that. But I said to myself, what could this be? I have not heard about it. So, of course, with a curious mind, I had to go in search of it. So what is Magna Charta, which was proclaimed in Kurukan Fuga? In the early 13th century, following a major military victory, the founder of the Mandingo Empire and the assembly of his wise men proclaimed in Kurukan Fuga the new Magna Charta, named after the territory situated above the upper Niger River basin between the present-day Guinea and Mali. I'm sure some of you will be curious enough to go and Google it, check it. But what use is knowing about the Magna Charta anyway? Why did I feel, or why did Dr. Saar feel, oh, you should have told, your teacher would have told you about this? Like it is something every African instructor, professor, researcher must know about and probably knows about. Just know about it like Nigeria, we held it. But knowing for its historical significance, the Charter is considered to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest constitutions in the world, dating back to the 13th century. The Magna Charta wasn't just about setting up a government. It established laws and social principles meant to guide people's lives within the empire. Learning about the Magna Charta can broaden your understanding of history, law, and culture in Africa. Now, I would want to ask of you all just one indulgence. If you have a pen or something to write upon, as we go along, I would be very, very delighted if you can take one action point that may come out of this presentation, something you plan to do, whatever it is. So at this point of the presentation, I'm aware that most of you know the answer to the question above. What is the state of knowledge production on the continent of Africa? If I must repeat what you already know, then it is said that historically, knowledge about Africa has been produced by Western scholars, often with a focus that doesn't address Africa's specific needs. Why did that happen? I was having a conversation with a professor at the University of Kent, and he said, well, I said, I'm going to tell the American students to do research on Gani Fayemi. Oh, and he said, oh, fine, that's great. At least they will bring in an outside perspective. But I said that half in jest and wholly serious, that a person like Gani Fayemi, who did so much work in the courts in our land, I am yet to know anybody who has done a critical analysis of his work, of all those legal activism. But I was saying it half in jest, that I'm sure maybe an American student is planning to do it. Why do we have to leave outsiders to look in so that they might have a different perspective? What about our own perspective? What is it? The least anybody could do, just go on Google, put together what you have seen and just say internet compilation of the struggles of Gani Fayemi. And then there are gaps and people can fill it. But if any one of you is aware of work, a critical work that has been done about Gani Fayemi, please point me to such works. Then, again, I ask, what is the state of knowledge production on the continent of Africa? There is a growing recognition of the importance of Africa-led knowledge production to address the continent's challenges and goals, like Agenda 2063. Again, I raise the point, what is Agenda 2063? Is there anyone here who is not aware of the African Union's plan for the future? What do you know? Do you care to even know what has been in the books and how Africa, using the template of the Adedeji Economic Commission of Africa, when the Western world was talking about structural adjustment program, the ECA under Professor Adedeji came up with what was called the AFSAP, the African Structural Adjustment Program. I don't hear about it. I don't know how many people know about it. I have had to teach Agenda 2063 in my class, and I have brought in people in the African Union to educate me and the students about Agenda 2063. Yes, I know that if you look at the ages of most of us gathered here, most of us probably would not last till 2063. But the contributions we'll make to help and fashion, remodel, refashion that agenda will go a long way to the Africa of the future that we want. Maybe the future is too far. Maybe we should look at the contemporary time. There is a must-watch video presentation titled Rerouting Knowledge Production in Africa, In Search of Our Roots by Professor Sylvia Tamale of Uganda. I have put this here, and if anybody is interested, I will send the link. I've sent the link to the convener. But I do not need to reinvent the wheel. All the theories of Afrofeminism, the concept of time and its relation to capitalism, the difference between monochromatic time and polychromatic time, like we talked yesterday during the presentation on Indonesia by on the Humanitas platform. This woman has encapsulated everything we need to know. But what is left is, what are we going to do? Who is going to do anything? Or this is just one of those things in which It's Sunday evening. Some of us have gone to church, and we just want to relax. My yardstick and my objective for this is that hopefully somebody will be moved enough to do something, no matter what it is that you choose to do. If nothing, try and listen to Professor Sylvia Tamale, who used to work at Makerere University. So what are the challenges in knowledge production? These are no-brainers. These are things you already know. And these are things that Trust Africa. And I'm sure before you all leave, you're going to hear that name, Trust Africa, so many times. Because by the time he finished in my class, I just felt, why are we not supporting an organization like this? I would pardon you if you don't know about Trust Africa. But all they want to do is to Africanize philanthropy, to make sure that funding that we need for important things come from within Africa. And I probably will talk more about that later. So the challenges are what you know: limited funding and resources. Many African universities and research institutions face significant funding and resource constraints, limiting their ability to invest in research, infrastructure, and knowledge dissemination. At the workshop, at the conference, or the Africa Week gathering at Leeds University, we had the pleasure of the presence of the Vice Chancellor of Igbinidion University, Professor Lawrence Moye. And we also had the virtual presence of the Vice Chancellor of University of Namibia. And both of them revealed something very interesting, that we have moved now from just teaching what the professor or the instructor was taught to now having people from industry, various manufacturing industries, have offices at the university, and the university also having a desk or an office in the industry. And so they're talking about triple helix, whereby you have the university as research centers, you have industry, and you have government, and you have businesses. So research now is done in solving the problems that the industry brings to the universities. Like in Namibia, mining, they already have people who have challenges in the mines. They will bring the problem to the university, and the students will learn about how to solve it. This is different from the industrial attachment that Nigeria threw a lot of money on, and there was nothing. This is right from when they're being trained. And then the people from the industries are also allowed to take a look at the syllabus and say, look, this is obsolete. These are the new things, and these are the new ways. So yes, the whole question of research and development is being taken seriously. As to the funding, we have TED Fund in Nigeria. And TED Fund, unfortunately, is only for public universities. And the private universities have been asking how they can also benefit from TED Fund. Apart from TED Fund now, the government has also created another stream, which is student loan. But the way the student loan is structured is that the money goes directly to the university. So there is, or a part of it goes to the university, which means that there are some kind of certainty in planning. The only thing I cannot say is what happens to these funds that get to the universities. So yes, we are aware of the limited funding, but it is not the same across the continent. The one that I am aware of is the question of language barriers, because to sound intelligent and look intelligent, you must be able to speak English. And it is the primary language of academic. and you would know any immigrant that first comes to America or to Europe will be told, you have to go to the writing program. And if you go to the writing program, they would help you write or re-articulate your thoughts in a way that Americans and Europeans can understand it. This going all over the map, like you do when you speak as an African, would not cut it here. So we have that, and that's stigmatization. And if you've ever had the opportunity of talking to somebody from a Francophone Africa, come to a place where English is the predominant language, they always say to themselves, I, who is reckoned with greatly in my country, I now look like an imbecile here because I can't even put my thoughts into the language in which they speak. Before now, maybe 50 years ago, there were many more languages that you could publish in. But the gatekeepers of knowledge or the judges of epistemology, like Professor Sylvia Tamale talked in her presentation, they have decided that it's going to be English. So the academic publication can create barriers for African scholars whose work may be less accessible to international audiences. But the question we ask is, why must we pander to these international audiences? The third one, the third leg of a tripod, lack of research capacity. Some African countries have a relatively small pool of highly trained researchers, limiting their overall research capacity and output on the continent. I can tell you the good news here, that the African universities, through the AU, have been working on scholars' mobility, meaning that a student could start year one in Nigeria and do year two in Gambia, depending on the research. And the AU has created centers of excellence. But like everything Africa, it is kept like a secret. And because when you don't shine light on it, then there are no critical appraisal of what you're doing. Not a lot of people can critique it or even tell you how to make it better. So they try to just keep it down low and waiting until the time when it succeeds and everybody can share part of it. Okay. If you, like they always say, if you identify the problems, you should also be able to search around for solutions. Opportunities for advancement. Increased collaboration, like I've told you. Fostering international and regional research collaborations can help African scholars assess resources, expertise, and global networks, while also elevating African perspectives in the global knowledge landscape. Yes, all of these tie in to Agenda 2063. It ties into the whole idea of a Pan-African movement, a borderless African continent where knowledge can move, where funds can move. I'm sure you all know that moving from Nigeria to Egypt, as you cross each border, there are over 42 different currencies that you will meet. So look at it financially and look at it knowledge-wise. Yes, you move from Lagos, you move to Benin Republic, you move to Togo, you move to Ghana. As you move, you change from English to French, from French to Ghanaian English, from Nigerian English, and so on and so forth. But I hope that what the African Union, through the Centers of Excellence, one is in UI, and they bring your emerging researchers together so that they can know each other, they can build on each other's knowledge. But if we can't move physically, if we can't move from country to country, thank God for digital transformation. The rapid growth of digital technologies and open access publishing platforms creates new opportunities for African scholars to share their work and connect with global audiences, overcoming traditional barriers to knowledge dissemination. I just hope that you read this just on the surface. When the rubber meets the road is when you would exactly know that if you're holding a webinar with people on the African continent, have the time, or well, let me be generous, maybe 20% of the time, the person disappears, freezes up, and comes back again. And I ask myself, how well can we communicate when the ICT, the information communication technology, is still at its barest basic? So the policy initiatives, governments and international organizations are increasingly recognizing the importance of supporting and investing in African research and innovation, leading to the development of new policy initiatives and funding. I wish people like Dr. Fru Divine were here, or Dr. Isabella Bodering. These are the giants that have been pushing for research ethics to find out ways in which Europe will partner with the African continent, as opposed to what they do. What they do presently is that Europe has the money, and then the African researchers will be informants. They will be the junior authors in whatever is found. Because he who pays the piper should also dictate the tune. But we need to, and there's been a charter, a knowledge equity charter that has been circulating, which came off University of Bradford, but has a group in South Africa through Dr. Fru Divine and University of Pretoria. They are trying to get African vice chancellors to sign off on this. The next thing is, how do they cascade it? Because if the vice chancellor knows about it, how do you get it to the department heads? How do you get it from the department heads to those who are doing the work? So there are structures. We just need a culture to fit that. When we talk about knowledge production, I've taken you through what I know. The consumption is what you know already, that in different ways, again from the West, they created a series called Conversations. And what Conversation does, and uses a person like Deacon Wale Fatade, they go around looking for those published materials using scientific journal, using scientific jargon, and they try to step it down. They translate the ideas so that others can read and be accessible to it. Yes, they're doing that in Conversations. And I'm sure some newspapers at times tried. And there's a whole organization in South Africa that looks at science communication. And all they're doing in science communication is to make scientific terms available to the general public. The same thing, there is a group that looks at science and explains it in Yoruba language. The newsletter has just come out. If anybody is interested in it, Professor Julius Fakilede has a group of which Dr. Tunde Adegbola is also a member. And Dr. Tunde Adegbola is somebody who is so passionate about using science or using Yoruba epistemology to explain some of these scientific terms. So you have academic journals, books, and other print-based materials which have not been the primary channels for dissemination of knowledge in Africa. Through access to these resources, though access to these resources can be limited in some regions, then the informal networks, such as what we're doing here, the conferences, the workshops, the social media, they play a crucial role in exchange of ideas and the sharing of knowledge within the African academic community. The digital platform, like I've explained, but it also has its own limitations. So, what is missing in how knowledge is consumed on the continent? There is a brother who came up with a publication called Omoluabi 2.0. His name is Adewale Ajadi. And there are so many other scholars that have been calling for alternative spaces of knowledge dissemination on the continent. And this is a very simple idea. The thing is, when you use the Western model to collect data, it's just fair to the West that you report it in the way the West can consume it. Maybe they sponsored it. So why would you not? So you will use all their conventions in the dissemination. But people are calling for alternative spaces, because when we go to conferences, there are paper presented, just like I'm doing, and then there'll be questions, and everybody goes home. But if we go to a village square, the way we organize ourselves in the village square is always very different from the way the universities do their own. They expect you to have an abstract, methodology, yada, 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 yada. But there are other ways. And I have argued in conversations with friends that there is a need for an annual assembly of artisans, leadership of markets, that is the market women and the market men who are in position of authorities, leadership of motor park associations, and other informal sectors. I want you to take a look. Codestra is one of the biggest organizations for social research on the African continent. And the history of it has to do with Shamin Amin, who had problems in Egypt and then gathered people around. And they wanted it financed from Africa. And I wrote a piece wanting Codestra to take a look that you have got, some of the researchers have gone to markets, they've gone to motor parks to extract information. What would it be if you brought the Juakalis from Kenya and the fabricators in Nigeria, and you bring them together and tell them what you found and how they can develop their skill? Can you imagine for once somebody who understands the technicalities of financial investments talking to the market women that have cash flow on how to invest their money in a way that they will not be cheated? But you see, we are elites. We are Western trained, and our thinking appears to be Western trained as well. If anybody knows Dakwalo Yomi, the owner of Premium Times, I have over times, sometimes late into the night, begging, how can your newspaper not have just one edition where you will bring these artisans, explain to them what the news, the trend in the news has been, and listen to them, and then package it and give it to the elites? I don't know, I still can't understand. My friend Dakwalo Yomi is a very progressive-minded person. But if Dakpo will not do it or cannot do it, I cannot see who will do it. But it is an essential part. When I spoke with the Readers Association of Nigeria, I said the same thing to them. What you're doing with schools, you can do with the market women as well. You can do, the good thing is that Oluomo, one of the Lankies, one of the real majors in motor park politics in Lagos State, somebody wrote a book on his behalf, which means that he can bring his friends and they can read and dramatize what has been written for him and get them interested. But I cannot get my ideas beyond my lips. And that's why I have found this, that at the end of it, instead of a conclusion. I want each and everybody to pledge what they can possibly do. We need those alternative spaces. We cannot, we should not rely only, because yes, it is cheaper, it is easier to do what we've been doing, but somebody said madness is actually doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Somehow, today, the 9th of June, 3 days before June 12th, we must find a way, look ourselves in the eye and decide what we're going to do. This is all just grammar. Imagine interdisciplinary trends. The interdisciplinary approaches. African scholars are increasingly embracing interdisciplinary approaches to research, drawing on insights from fields like sociology, anthropology, and environmental studies to address complex real-world challenges. Yes, I used to be a program assistant for Nigerian Environmental Study and Action Team. This had high-powered intellectuals, Professor Igbozuruike, D.O.O. Okali, David Okali, Ademola Salao of blessed memory, Tade Aino, the great man in the humanities at Unilag, who's been moving from Carnegie to masterclass, sitting atop millions of dollars and doling it out to different groups and organizations on the African continent. These were the men I worked with. And they all brought their perspectives. Professor Loge, who in the 60s had written a book on geography. Emmanuel, Dr. Emmanuel as well. They all came together under the banner. But unfortunately, like everything African, it has not outlived them. The indigenous knowledge systems. As a young graduate, I met Dr. David Ate, who was the person, if you say indigenous knowledge systems, I always thought about him because he seemed to have spent, he's a geographer, and he seemed to have spent a lot of his time looking at indigenous knowledge systems. There is a growing recognition of the value and importance of indigenous knowledge systems in Africa. And I know that in South Africa, it happens. I worked with somebody there too, which are being integrated into academic research and teaching to provide more holistic understanding of local contexts and realities. Sometimes these are just like, in the margins. Don't say I did not tell you kind of thing. When we were in the botany class in the 80s, they would bring High Priest Ebohon to just one class to tell us about how plants could be used for medicine. And as soon as he left, that was not the main menu. That was just, it wasn't even snack, in fact. But he came. But later in my life, I ran across Professor David Opako, who championed the idea of herbal medicine in Nigeria from a pharmacy perspective. All right, yes, the transnational collaborations and the collaborators, they're there. The only thing we have to work out is how can we be partnership? Well, how can there be partnership whereby they're not just using us as informants, but they're using us, or we are co-producers of knowledge. And the policy engagement, I think I have talked a little bit about that. All right. If you asked me at the beginning of this, I would have told you that I would like to dedicate this to Brother Ali. Those in Humanitas already met him. And those of you who haven't met him, I hope you will take time out to explore the Afro perspectives. It's a global African initiative, and the caliber of scholars on the mailing list is unbelievable. No, these are people who have what it takes to make a change on the continent of Africa. That pause is to say, in case some of you are asking, but why are they not making the change? I would leave that hanging because they would rather speak for themselves. They're adults. I cannot speak for them. Afro perspectives in their objective will contribute to the global effort to reconceptualization and paradigms change through the re-evaluation and or intervention of endogenous concepts capable of reflecting the plurality of worldviews. Intellectual independence, rigorous research approaches, and freedom of expression in exchanges are the foundations of the credibility of this think tank, which is not affiliated with any political, economic, or other interest groups or school of thought. And on the Guardian WhatsApp platform, I raised the issue once that are these veteran journalists aware that Africa had its own indigenous governance system? And somebody asked me, if we don't know about it, then it means that it's almost inconsequential. Why are we not being taught? Why don't we as adults, most of them are over 60 or getting to 60, they've never heard that there were actually indigenous governance systems. Yes, democracy looks as if it's, once you say governance, it's either democracy or the Chinese form of governance or the Russian form of governance where there are elections, but only one person wins it. Democracy is not one thing. But is there an African flavor to democracy? This is what the Afro perspective, the website is so rich. If you do nothing, please go to that website on my behalf and just look around and look at the resources you have, either for yourself or for your children or for your family members. But this is something that addresses everything I have to say. I don't need to repeat what they have already done. Okay, just for the sake of the academics here, you all know all of these: African Studies Review, African Affairs, African Geographical Review, and African Journal of AIDS Research. Most of the time, when I go to conferences, I come up with some crazy ideas. One professor from Kenya said, oh, should we not include the impact your research is making on the community as one of the indices for promotion? I shot up my hand. I said, please, for God's sake, do not. Don't burden these people with that. Instead of impact, is there no way in which they can put in the proposal how they're going to disseminate their findings as opposed to impact? Because how do you measure impact? It's late Dr. Aribede would say, asking the impact of what you're doing is the right question at the wrong time. Okay. So promoting African scholarship globally. I'm just going to run through. Elevate African voices, increase visibility, foster collaborations, support policy engagement. These are things we can do, but the question is how? And are we going to do it? Okay. The way forward. I've told you, and I'm going to say it many times, trust Africa. Trust Africa is an organization you need to pay attention to. Support them. If all you can give is $1, fine. But at least be aware there are 10 people, 10 participants, or maybe 12 listening to the sound of my voice. If you can tell one more person, research about Trust Africa, reach out to them, just say to them, Kole talked about you. Please keep on the good work. Encourage them in whichever way you can, and then promotion of collaboration is not too difficult. Embracing digital transformation, inform policy making. Conclusion. There is no conclusion, but an open invitation to decide on an action plan. Where do we go from here? What can each of us do? Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Prof. I mean, that was really, really very, very deep. That was really very incisive, straight to the heart of the topic, straight to the heart of the issue at hand. And what I particularly love about it, sir, is that you have actually left all of us to. You've actually gotten us really to start thinking, to start asking questions regarding quite a lot of the things you have raised. And before we go to the next bit of it, I believe it's just really proper to recognize quite a few people in our midst. I saw a face. I was like, some of us when we were growing up, there were certain things. Some of us who consumed quite a lot of literary content on the internet. And I was like, is that the same name that I used to see on the internet as a little kid? J. Everett Green. And straight away I got thinking, and so I just went online. I saw that face is unmistakable. I'm gonna bring him on as well, just so everyone can just have a look at so basically it's that face is just unmistakable. At times you wouldn't. It's always a thing of blessing for people like us to be able to eventually to be able to put a face to that name that we've always known. And it is my pleasure to just really appreciate your presence this evening. Is I believe Professor J. Everett Green, if I'm correct, he's a professor of philosophy and author of the 1997 book Kant's Copernican Revolution: The Transcendental Horizon, and the founder of the Philosophy Born of Struggle Conference. Professor Green, it's such a pleasure having you in our midst, you and your wife, Mrs. Green. It's a pleasure having you. I believe you want to say something, go on, sir. And I know you still have more chance to say something when the conversation goes on. But it is a pleasure for me because I believe maybe I was in secondary school or university, I can't recall exactly now. I came across that name, and finally after 30 odd years or thereabout, I'm putting a face to it. Pleasure having you with us, sir.
Great to be here. Great to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And of course, again, I've got quite a few people that those are names, that I equally want to really, really. And of course, we've got Dr. Pasha Egos. I don't know if I'm correct. I know you correct me when you.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Pasha is academic. Is the academic manager for international collaboration at the University of Florida.
Yes.
Am I correct, sir?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, it's such a pleasure having you in our midst. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know, of course, we're going to have quite a bit of conversation and having a word from each and every one of you at some point. It is also my pleasure. I believe it is the same Miss Khadija Ibrahim. If you live in the United Kingdom, you probably would have, I hope it's the same. I believe it's the same person. If you live in the United Kingdom, especially if you live in the North, you probably heard of that name more than once, at least. Ours is a face that is very, very, that is everywhere in the arts, in the artistic environment. It is my pleasure. I believe I knew it. It's the same Miss Khadija Ibrahim. She's one of Yorkshire's most prolific poets. She's artistic director of Lead Young Authors. She's a literary activist. You know, every time I've seen that in the past, I'm like, literary activist. One day I really want to know a bit more. Of course, I can read it, what an activist means, but to be a literary activist. She's a theater maker and a published writer. Miss Khadija Ibrahim, you're most welcome. It's a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. I do not know if I've, oh yeah, and I believe we've got Dr. Diana Rogerio with us as well. Dr. Diana Rogerio, Associate Professor of Spanish, University of Memphis. I believe she's here with us. Dr. Diana Rogerio, Associate Professor of Spanish, University of Memphis. Okay, so I know Mr. John Bash, you're also here with us. Thank you so much. But in the meantime, we just continue with the conversation. Now, I'm going to go back to you, Dr. Odutola, and I'm going to ask you. Now, you've thrown the question to all of us tonight, and you've kicked. I wouldn't say you've kicked the can, because that would be like you're leaving the responsibility for others. But you've actually opened the can, not a can of worms, but you've opened, and there's so many things in that can. Now, in terms of knowledge production in Africa, I know you've done a very excellent literary work by not really putting the blame on the doorstep of anyone. But we really need to interrogate it. What do you think? And also your colleagues who are here tonight, what would be your question to them so that I can get them into this conversation? And who is to blame? Because I know you've tried to avoid that topic. Who is to blame? Is it a governmental failure? Is it an institutional failure? Is it historical? Is it historical? Or is it something that actually gone on in the recent years? Or is it us as Africans? Are we the problem?
I would have, you know, in ways in which politicians will say that that's a very good question. And but I'm sure it's not about the evaluation of a question, it's the answer. A person like Dr. Tunde Adegbola, who has just joined, will tell you how much he's doing as an individual. It's not a question of blame. Dr. Seyinde Arigbede, the late Seyinde Arigbede, would always tell me that Africans have what he calls cultural self-defense. You can come onto the African continent, you're looking, you're seeing activities, but you don't understand them if you're an outsider. An outsider to the continent is not just somebody who's come from Europe. Somebody who leaves Lagos to Ibadan might be an outsider to the activities of Ibadan. And the way in which we have conducted our business, you remember there was a time in which they said Africa was a dark continent. It was not because NEPA was failing or there was no electricity. It was because information was not getting out. John McCall of University of Illinois, Carbondale, in the early days of Nollywood, would say that those of us outside do not understand what is happening. Those of them inside cannot explain what they're doing. That was Nollywood production. When people were just telling stories in a haste, using whatever they found. They were not interested in all the technicalities and the dynamics of production of what the West would want. Because when you zoom in and take an extreme close-up, it means something to the West. They have a language of production, of which Nollywood, I don't know whether they were aware of it, or it didn't really matter. But they had their own cultural philosophy that Ojuloro wa. So when they go and do an extreme close-up, it's because in the culture, it says that the discourse is in the eyes. And so they will do a close-up. But the West, it meant something totally different. We were not speaking their language. And what Professor Biodun J. will say, when are we going to develop our own African aesthetic judgment, where we can look at our artwork and evaluate it based on our own thinking of what it is? So to answer your question, and I hope I can pull in Dr. Adegbola to also say what they are producing, the knowledge they are producing. We're producing, right? But the thing is that it is not being spread on the global commons the way it should be. And because, like the Yoruba will say, Bishweni bata, aman for what bojeni, meaning that when your yam sprouts, you don't go around telling everybody that, oh, this is the sprouting of my yam. There are two things we're not doing. We are an oral tradition. We pass things on orally. And you know that once it is oral, it means that the person you're passing it on, before telephone and technology, the person had to be just opposite you. And so we did a lot of that within the community. And our community was also divided into the ones we call Onimo Ejile. That is, those who understood the technicalities of knowledge. And then the Ogberi. Most of us you meet in the West, most of the scholars, African scholars you meet in the West, they are mostly Ogberi. They are people who are not steeped in the functions and functioning of the cults. The knowledge they know is peripheral. And they're so loud. They go about talking about what they don't have an in-depth knowledge of. So it's not a blame thing. It's not that Africa is not producing. What I will leave Dr. Adegbola to talk about. Are we producing knowledge in the area of nanotechnology? Before Professor Kole Odutola died, he set up an institute and a center in Akure that was supposed to look at how Yoruba people could tap into nanotechnology. He was very concerned about it until he passed on. So Tiwantiwa is by Dr. Adegbola, and they also do things. But in his own case, he's not shy. If you want to hear, you can read his paper on drum surrogacy, where he's used probability to explain what the drums are saying. And you know, Brother Osheni knows that he can hear the drum. He might not be able to decipher it. He's a Yoruba man. There are many Yoruba people who can hear the drum, but they can't decipher. That is how, please pardon this word, esoteric the knowledge of the Yoruba people had become, and how we have not taken time to pay attention. Yeah. So let me leave it at that. And in case there are comments.
Okay, can I say something quickly?
Yeah, Mrs. Green, please go on, Mrs. Green. Yeah,
and thank you very much for your, remarks and introduction. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm outside Africa, right? And because of history, just recently through Ancestry.com, I discovered that, mainly Nigerian. But for many, many years, I did not know what part of Africa I came from, and that's history, because I am a descendant of slaves from Africa. And I'm going to bring in a perspective that may not be very, very a sad one. Yesterday, we had a wonderful presentation from Dr. Pasha, and two of the gems that he left with us. He's left with us several gems, but one of them, he talked about decolonization of the mind, how that is so necessary. And he also talked about colonization of other people, how we colonize each other, right? And so that has been happening a lot within the Caribbean, where I'm from originally, and here in the United States. So I want to point out that a big part of the what Europe projected in terms of Africa is a hierarchical structure in which African culture was always at the bottom and European culture was at the top. And African culture was not only at the bottom, but it was also demonized. African people cannot do anything. Egypt and the pyramids, Egypt is carved out completely from Africa. And of course, people from Africa could never contribute to the building of the pyramids. And wherever anything was found, whether the walls in Zimbabwe or anywhere, it was white people who did it. So I was brought up with this view, this hierarchical structure in which Africa was not only at the bottom as the most inferior culture on the planet, but it was also demonized. Nothing good can come out of Africa. And this is why I was taught that it was a good thing that we were enslaved, because in this way, we were Christianized and also civilized. And I think that is something that we have to address. Now, I know I'm outside of Africa, so, in a sense, but unless that becomes a part of our project to deal with this demonization of African culture, which still persists in the Caribbean, where people are ashamed of being African, and it is persists in the Caribbean and in African, in the African American culture. Now, there are quite a number of African Americans who have tried or have, to try to debunk this, but I just want to add one little thing, that their values within the European culture. The values are, if you're successful, to be successful, to have a big home, to have a car. I think Dr. Pasha brought up some of that, what it means to be at the top of the society, to be successful. But also included in the values, and it's white people are very good, and the European culture is normative, and we are for democracy and all that. But included in those values is a strong belief that you can discriminate against Africans, and you can, and Africans are, demonized and criminalized. So when you, as a Black person, if you want to make it, the thing to do is to move as far as possible from anything having to do with Africa. And I just think that we have to include this, what we have inherited in any move forward in terms of progress and, you know, changing the narrative.
Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Green. That was, I think I'll just pass that over to Dr. Odutola. Mrs. Green has made quite a lot of interventions there. She's brought another angle into the conversation. You know, so let me come to you on that before we go to Dr. Adebola, and then of course Dr. Pasha, Miss Ibrahim, and Professor Everett as well. So let's come over to you, sir.
Well, the comment is right on the money. You know that the African Union has declared the Caribbeans the sixth section, or the sixth geopolitical space. And so African Union recognizes the Caribbeans and the islands, and they're as much African as the rest of us. Everything that is happening in the Caribbean also happening back on the African continent. This whole question of demonization, the question of stigmatization, I was discussing yesterday with somebody that everything Western, and somebody has said we must make a distinction between de-Westernization and decoloniality, because the development pathway that we started to follow was to be like the West. And you remember the man who wrote The West and the Rest of Us, Chiwenzu, or even what Frantz Fanon has said. The resetting of our brains that everything white is good. In the early days of African Guardian, they wouldn't even use the expression black male. They wouldn't use black sheep. They felt these were part of a narrative arsenal of the Western world to demonize the racial class termed black. We are not black people by color, but we are black by their own division. So it makes sense to them, and so you have things like black sheep, black leg, and stuff, and all of that. And Jesus, who was born in the Middle East, is portrayed as white. And if you care to check your Google, just type in Republican Jesus, you would see that he keeps on changing in the cover of different books. So I'm at one with Mrs. Green about what is happening. You know, the knowledge that is produced in the Caribbeans, most of the things that are there were taken away from Africa. They still do it. They still, the pharmacopoeia in the Caribbeans, though it is hidden. There are people who still use what Sister Khadija will call bush tea. No, she calls it bush tea, which is agbo, and which Dr. Adebola will say agbo is to extract. No, yes, call it bush tea. We know that it's there. We know that when they're sick, the kind of the healing methods are still African. Even right down to the expression Iri. Iri means blessing. In Yoruba, it is Ire, because we say E and they say I. So we're still the same. We still share the same epistemology, but the Western violence to what we believe and how it's been degraded are the things that we have to fight. You know, we are entering, I didn't talk about the entrance into what is called the fourth revolution. You know, the fourth revolution People have been asking, where is Africa? Where is the Caribbean? No, but they're there. We just need to have dialogues with ourselves. But let's not make this a talk shop. Let's not make it talk. Let's ask ourselves, what can we do? What can I do? You know, to either bring in one more person, you know, to understand or do something to reshape where we are. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Prof. I don't know if Dr. Adebola is ready, because you mentioned you wanted him to have, because I would also be going to Dr. Pasha, Ms. Ibrahim, and Open. And of course, we've got the Secretary General of our organization, Shalafa Emi there, and DSG, Mr. Freedom Okunuga is there as well. So, Dr. Adebola, are you ready, sir? So we come to you now, oh yeah, Dr. Adebola is ready. Let's go with you now, sir. And then,
yes,
of course,
please.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's been quite an interesting.
By the way, sorry, sir. Just I believe. So sorry. It's just to properly introduce you. My apologies, sir. So Dr. Adebola is actually a very, very popular name in the place where I come from. One day I hope I can have a one-to-one session with him and ask him, because I did read somewhere in a newspaper article once that I was involved in setting up quite a lot of private TV and radio stations in Nigeria. And I'm like, how have you done all these things? You know, but he is the executive director of African Languages Technology Initiative. It's such a pleasure having you in our midst. He's a linguist, he's a cultural activist as well. Dr. Adebola, you may continue, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these kind words. Yes, my name is Tunde Adebola, Executive Director of African Languages Technology Initiative. What we do is to make African languages usable, make modern ICTs, information communication technologies, usable in African languages. And in doing that, we have had to look into our past and look at the communication technologies in our past and build upon these technologies. A lot of the things I've had this evening about the demonization of Africa, about colonization, about the various schemes and, as it were, plots that have, as it were, demonized and dehumanized us. But one aspect of it that I have been applying my scholarship to in recent times is the fact that we seem to explain our past only by mysticism. A lot of the science in our past have kind of become mystified. And I believe the background to that is that for centuries, the brightest and the best amongst us, our cognoscenti, our intellectuals, were taken into slavery time and time and time again, to the extent that the opportunity to pass down our scientific knowledge from the present generation of scholars at a point to the next generation, we were denied that opportunity for centuries. And for that reason, our science became mysteries. I have had the privilege of investigating a number of the scientific principles in our past. I even wrote a book chapter in a book talking about the transmission of scientific knowledge in African orature. And I see a lot of deep scientific principles in our past, which we explain only by mysticism. And I think this probably is one of the aspects of our confusion we should address with urgency. We should be able to go beyond the limitations of literature to the orature that defined and described our past, and expand scholarship to the extent that we can build scholarship on orature with all the claimed weaknesses of it, because it is through orature that a lot of the scientific principles my scholarship has discovered in our past was transmitted. They were all transmitted within orature. So despite the fact that we had these centuries of slavery, despite the fact that we didn't have a complex system of writing, a lot of the knowledge of our past, the scientific knowledge in our past, still managed to pass through orature. So it means that there's a lot we can still do with orature, and this is an area in which we need to adjust our scholarship, adjust our academia, and look more deeply and more keenly into our past from a point of view of the assumption, the hypothesis that having lived in a world of cause and effect, it cannot be that our past can only be explained by mysticism. I'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adebola. That was, I mean, straight away, I'm like, orature, you know, it's, I know it's a concept I've heard just in passing that I've never really paid attention to. But I probably have to read a lot more about it tonight. I know it talks about, you know, the concept of language, whether it's spoken or something, you know, but I know I need to read about it. Thank you so much, sir. But Doctor, we'll leave you out until we just collect all the views of our guests, of our other guests tonight, and then we'll come back to you in closing, Dr. Odutola. Let me go to Ms. Khadija Ibrahim. What is your perspective on this, ma'am? And then after that, I go to Dr. Pasha and of course, Professor Everett. Yeah.
Oh, good evening. So, you know, I'm always fascinated that when I'm in these conversations, where do I place myself? And Mrs. Green, thank you so much for the such poignant points that you made, because they're very important points. As someone that was born in Britain to Jamaican parentage, who was raised as an African child in Britain, always knowing that I was African and that I am African because that was what was in the household, it still raises questions, and I have to go over these questions. Mrs. Green said them so beautifully, and they're very important points. And my point is, wherever we go in the world, if you take a man from China, after 400 years, he's still from China. 500 years, he's still from the Middle East, wherever. But you take an enslaved African body and you displace them, there's something other than African. And that is what was taught to us. And I believe that's what Mrs. Green is really explaining there to you, that the pyramid section of what is respectable, and that we're supposed to be fortunate people because we were taken from this dark continent. And unfortunately, these conversations don't extend enough from the African continent to the Caribbean to Britain. And I was raised in a household with grandparents who raised me on the philosophy of Marcus Garvey, Africans for Africans. And I never understood that as a child, but as I got older, I began to understand the importance of that philosophy to ensure that not just myself, but my household, my children recognize themselves as Africans, so they will never ever feel embarrassed about a history that doesn't actually belong to them, the history of colonization and the history of displacement. And so I've always said these conversations are stronger when we open up the borders to the diaspora and we begin to embrace all Africans across the diaspora. my collection of poetry that was published in 2014, Another Crossing, is really about that. Another Crossing, the title says, is really about yet another crossing of Black bodies across the ocean. So from the African continent to the Americas, and then my grandparents and that Windrush generation is yet another crossing. And some may say that they arrived in Britain, or some of those that went to the United States, but mainly to those that went to Britain, that they were happy to go, that they went voluntarily to England to work. But actually, it was yet another forced migration. And that forced migration was based on a lie. And that migration of that Windrush generation that ended up in a hostile environment in 2015 was based on the compensation that was yet to be paid to the enslaved masters of the Caribbean once the enslaved Africans were so-called freed. Britain had to pay compensation, and they had no other way to pay this but to invite people from their colonies, mainly the Caribbean, across Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and other islands, to go and work in Britain for small amounts of money, for these people to live in very cramped and poor accommodation where they were not celebrated at all. You know, and so I'm a result of that migration. I'm a result of a child that was born under those circumstances. And so if you know how harsh those situations are when you live in Britain, so we're supposed to be happy here because we are the ones that are more educated, so they say. But actually, it's not true. Because if you lose yourself and you find out that you have no home, because if I go to Jamaica, I'm considered an English girl, I'm a foreigner. If I go to the African continent, depends on where I go, they may say, welcome home. But I still have to get a visa to enter the continent in various places. I still have to have a visa. I can only stay there a period of time. So I'm only semi-welcomed. And so for me, the important thing, I think the point that I'm trying to make is, it's not just decolonizing the archives, it's decolonizing the mind across Africa and diaspora, and then together we are stronger in numbers. So then it's not a talking shop, it's actually a better conversation for forward change. And that's, you know, and that's what I wish for in my time. Now I'm in my 50s, and I hope that in my time I'm going to see some of those changes. And so I often have to prove who I am. You know, if I go to Jamaica, I have to tell them that I know the language, the home language of Jamaica, because it's the language that my grandparents spoke. And they would say, like Miss Lou would say, this patois is not broken English because it does not need fixing. It is a combination of enslaved African voices and all the other colonies that came together, and it's very, very rich. And if you unpick the language of patois, regardless to which island you go to, you're going to find those rich African languages there. And so we know the power of the African continent through those enslaved bodies. We know the survival. We know how they were able to still maintain aspects of that culture in the braiding of their hair, in the fact that they could preserve aspects of this culture that today I can teach my grandchildren. I can make bush tea, as Kole said. I can make certain foods. I can introduce them to what we call hard food provisions like yam and cassava, and I can tell them the benefits of these foods. And so I think really the point that I'm trying to make here is we're better in numbers when we unify across the diaspora and not separate. And it's not just the people of the Caribbean that can't think of themselves as Africans, but it's also people in the African continent embracing those across the Caribbean and Britain. And that's, you know, that's my dream right there. So it's not a question, it's more about how do we move forward, I guess, to ensure that that happens.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. I saw the name, like I said, I was like, is that same name? You know, I link with Leeds, Yorkshire. You know, I've I think this is the first time I'm actually seeing the face apart from on TV, you know, in a close-up place. It's a pleasure finally being able to hear direct from you. Thank you so much. You've impacted many of us. You know, like I said about Professor Everett Green, you know, I was a secondary school kid, you know, I saw that name, and little would I know that many years down the line, I'll actually be speaking with him, you know, live across the internet divide. Thank you so much, Ms. Ibrahim. I know German Anikulapo has joined us as I know he's a UNESCO, he's a resource person for UNESCO review of cultural policies and all this. We'll bring him on, but we need to go to Dr. Pasha and then Professor Green, and then we'll go to German Anikulapo, and then just quickly give some time to Doctor before we close. And of course, we've got Freedom Okunuga and Mr. Shola Fahimi there as well. So let's go to you, Dr. Pasha. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I really enjoyed Professor Kole's presentation, and I'm always struck by not only informative, but there's a humoristic tone too in what he's talking about, and I think that is important, and I think that's sort of what's so unique about you, Professor Kole. Like in the beginning, for example, you talked about, you know, conference, you know, tone, you know, 1, 2, 3. Is it a funeral, or is it a nostalgia or something? So I think that comes from many years of sort of a literature review of coming to all these events, and also your push toward, you know, what do we do now? And I think this is also important. Just yesterday, we also had a conversation with Professor Everett, with Mrs. Green, with Zay, right, with Professor Kole in our talk about Indonesia and decolonization. And I think one thing that I also want to make salient is regarding knowledge production. I totally agree with Professor Kole's Odutola's notion that there is no need for us to pander to the West or the Western notion of epistemology, that, you know, it has to be in this form, and then the only acceptable way of knowledge is if it's in a journal, and then this way, and then you form it that way. There needs to be more informal networks too. And I think that cuts across Africa and also in Indonesia, where I'm from, Southeast Asia, where although we've been decolonized formally in terms of state decolonization, but in our minds, after 3.5 centuries, almost 400 years of being colonized by the Dutch, that is always, there's always this, the mind, it takes longer to decolonize. So that's also continues in our work. So I totally agree with Khadija Ibrahim too, about your notion about decolonizing the mind. And about knowledge production, I think we also share some of the challenges, like Mr. Kole mentioned, you know, limited funds, you know, language barriers, and lack of research capacities. And you also noted the opportunities. So I think we share a lot of both of the challenges in knowledge production and also opportunities. And if I ever bring this to, you know, Indonesian forums, I'll be sure to cite you, Professor Kole, you know, this year ideas that I think it's the same homework in many ways for Indonesia too. And we also need to recognize our, of course, diaspora and also transnational diasporic, our shared struggle and our shared, you know, unification in decolonization. And that will even bring a even stronger unity in Africa, but also cutting across through Asia too, countries in the global South. And it's always interesting when there's always this notion that it's still prevalent that, you know, knowledge, it comes from, you know, the Greek, you know, the West, and then it transported. And one Native American professor that I have, he gives his anecdotal story about if a Native American scholar says, you know, there's a mountain in America, and he calls it, this is Mountain X, right? People will say, well, okay, you know, there's some debate there. But when there is a European professor confirms the finding and says, indeed, this is Mountain X. And people are like, ah, yes, indeed. So having the whiteness, the European, to confirm knowledge that it is indeed true, it is indeed valid, this needs to be obliterated. I'm using a very strong word, but indeed it needs to be obliterated, because knowledge comes from all over the place. It did not come from the Greeks and the Romans and then transferred to the world. It came out from all over. And this is something that we need to educate others, as well as reaffirm to ourselves, because knowledge production is all about power at the end. And then we need to in order to be more effective in our knowledge production, we need to question the nature of epistemology itself, right? So knowledge can come from, of course, from Africa, you know, and about the notion about the pyramids, you know, and that has sort of been, and that needs to be bring to the fore. So I think this is important. And also your I think the website that was mentioned by Professor Kole, Afro Perspectives, I'll definitely, you know, check into that, because these are you know, important. And let me see. Yeah, and also what Professor Odutola mentioned about mysticism, right? And going also toward the you know, sciences as recognizing that it's cause and effect. Okay? And one thing I would add to that also, there is in Indonesia something called the kearifan lokal, which is the local wisdom. And I think I'm moving more and more in my scholarship toward not just either or, but and. I think we can embrace the scientific perspective and also appreciate and embrace the local wisdom as well. Because the danger, if we say the local wisdom is inferior or not valid because it's based on mysticism, I'm concerned that we are also in that regard pandering to the Western notion of what knowledge is valid or not valid. So I think we use science, but we also recognize the power of local wisdom itself, which I'm sure in Africa is very rich. I'm definitely not an expert on that, but in Asia and Southeast Asia is also rich. So we need to cater to this as well and be cognizant of that. So, you know, those are some of my thoughts that appeared in my mind as I was hearing these all the speakers here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pasha. I like the way you actually you took a beat of everyone, you know, and you just put them all together. Thank you so much, Dr. Pasha. We really appreciate you. It's a pleasure having you here. We're hoping that we have more, you know, more days to come, you know, to just learn and take a few things from you. Thank you so much. Let me go to Professor Green. Prof, let's have your perspective on this. You're muted, sir. You're muted, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Thanks for the invitation from Dr. Kole to be part of this conversation, and thank you very much for leading, convener, chairing. This has been quite fascinating. And I have been already extremely educated, and some ignorance that I will come to a little later when I get back to what Brother Kole had to say. But let's continue with Dr. Pasha, because that's where, since his last one, had mentioned Dr. Adebola. I'm mangling his name, so forgive me. So, but that's where I would like to take up the whole question of knowledge. And when Dr. Adebola mentioned the whole distinction between mystification and causality, absolutely beautiful, because that has been the West what they call the invention of Africa by the West, in terms of mysticism, whereby the West is the most proficient inventor of mysticism. Going back to Plato, one of the most mystical there, and to the so-called idea of knowledge and ignorance and getting out of the cave. So the whole Western civilization is steeped in mysticism, including what came out of the Greek as the Judeo-Christian tradition, one of the most mystical tradition and esoteric in the world, if you look at idea like the Trinity, the word mystification. Rationality is fundamental to the African way of viewing the world, and the whole idea of causality that Professor Adebola mentioned is so fundamental, because that causality is one, they want to say, coming out of the West. What is it? It is the invention of Africa, if you want, the whole, because everything, there is a reason to be, and there is an explanation. And so the principle of causality is fundamental to the African situation that has been hijacked by the West and have given a mystical interpretation. Even when you look at quantum, which we won't have time to talk about today. So I would like to express my profound thanks to Dr. Adebola for making distinction between mystification and causality. When in July at our Humanitas, we're going to be recognizing the life and times of Pauline Hotunji. And so we're going to be going back to some of these stuff in terms of his philosophy and how we critique both Africa and the West. But let's, in the interest of time, let's move on now to Professor Dr. Kojo Ibrahim, which I am mangling, but forgive me. And your discussion about the question, the fundamental question of the 21st century, the whole idea of borders. Because the whole question of immigration that is happening in the United States, where the people now are being demonized, coming to their own country from Mexico. They come into America, which is bad. They come into their own country here. They are coming back. And the whole question of borders that have been invented by the West, and the whole question of what we call the partition of Africa and the invention of these borders. And that's part of the crime of Western civilization in their dismantling of Africa, dismantling of the Americas. And so this, unless one of the depressing thing in terms of human rights, that in terms of your presentation, is a whole question that we need to demolish all these borders. We need to break out these walls if we want to create a decent civilization, a decent humanity. These borders and these so-called passports will have to be burned at the dust heap of history to create a brand new civilization. And so the fundamental principle, this comes with fundamental of the 21st century. In the coast of Italy, in Greece, they are watching people drowned in the sea, coming from Africa and other places. This is the barbarism of the 21st century. And so your idea about borders, we will have to come a whole session to discuss it at maybe at Humanitas or some other places, what this crime against humanity in the invention of borders. Let's go now to Dr. Kole. From a philosophical point of view, because and discuss. That's one of my great philosophers used to say, William R. Jones. And so I am one of the ignorant folks. I've never heard of Mandan Charter. And so, Dr. Kole, I had hoped you're going to go back and not only tell us to go and look it. I hope it won't be on Wikipedia, but to go and look it up and be part of our discussion here today. There is no need to invent the wheel. You mentioned it there. And so, like other nations, in China, Confucianism is the fundamental principle of the society. Its philosophy, its religion, its science. And this is a glue to the people. And that's part of the marvel of China today, because they go back to the roots. They go back to Confucianism. And so the whole question of Mandan Charter, what is it? And then let us move on to look at Nigeria, look at its policy, because the policy is fundamental. Is this charter incorporated with it, and how it can be part of the system? Let's look at South Africa, because a number of things are happening there now. And how is it related to the Ubuntu principle? Since this was first and going back way then. And so the whole idea of worldview is fundamental, whether it is economics, whether it is science, whether it is geography. Worldview is fundamental for the development and the progress of the people. And so what is this worldview that is in this charter that can be part of the social, economic, cultural, philosophical system that the African continent can be embraced? How is it manifest? How does it manifest itself in the African Union's charter? And the whole question, because in Africa, we also have the whole idea of colonization, and not only Europe, it's also the Islamic colonization, which is part of Africa, that sometimes people shy away from, and has inhibited growth in many instances in terms of the development of Africa. So we're talking about going back to the roots here. So there is no need to invent the system. I know you gave a whole elaboration in terms of like the African perspective and the whole knowledge production, and the whole question of knowledge production and the Western system here, the so-called NGOs that are all over Africa, which is part of the Western system. And so the most, what I call the affront to Africa. You have youngsters graduated from Princeton and Yale and Harvard in development. and they are going to Africa to teach them how to do irrigation system and how to farm and the rest of it. When Africans have been doing it for time immemorial. But the whole question of when we're talking about funding and these things, we have to unpack, you know, what is the strain? What are the strains to funding? And how these things affect Africa, whereby the NGOs, 90% of the funding is for administrative purpose, going to people in the United States from these so-called Ivy League institutions. So the whole, there are whole fundamentals that we need to discuss, but I'm going to stop here. Let's get back to what this charter, what is fundamental to this charter and how this charter can be part of the policy system of countries in the African continent. And I rest my case.
Thank you so much. That was passionate, that was energetic, and you know, I mean, if Prof is talking about the Mandan principle and talking about being ignorant of it, people like us, that means we don't even exist, because basically today was my first time, and I really can't wait for this lecture to end, so that I want to dive into that, talking about the Fuga and all those, you know, I really want to learn about, and the charter itself. And I agree with Professor Green, you know, when he said, you know, it's like Dr. Odutola just basically has sent us on an errand, very brilliant, very intelligently, to go and unearth that charter. And I believe there's a lot of work, and I agree that really, what does it contain, and how does that help Africa? So I'll just, as we're going back to, we're going just a few more, and then we'll get to the close. Can I please plead with everyone that we just run over by 15 minutes, not more than that? Please just stay with us. And I'm going to be leaning on our emails.
Just a second. I don't know. Could you speak in the mic for me, please? Because I'm.
Oh, okay. Oh, so sorry.
Not too good here. So.
No worries. And so I was just talking about, you know, some of the points you made about that charter and what we need to make of it, and that. For me, once this meeting ends, I'm just going to really be jumping into that because it's a word that's come out to me from nowhere. I never ever knew. We know the charter in England, you know, it's so protected in England that, you know, to even have access to it.
Everybody talks about the Magna Carta.
Yeah, the Magna Carta, you know, in fact, it's so protected that, you know, to even have access to it, you know, everybody knows where it is. It's just, but where is this charter? Where is it kept? You know, this charter Dr. Kole has spoken about, you know. So we'll come back to him on that. So please, like I said, I want to plead with everyone that we just run over by like 15 minutes. Please just bear with us. I know the journalist, Mr. German and Nikolapo, I think he's having issues with his connection. We'll probably skip him for today. But let me go to very, very quickly. The former special advisor to the ex-governor of former governor of Oyo State of Nigeria, Mr. Yomi Yinka. Can we just quickly have a perspective from you? And after that, I go to Kenny Okunuga and Chola Fayemi, and I'm going to be leaning on those two to just take maybe one minute so that we can quickly run on. Mr. Yinka.
Dr. Yomi Yinka.
Dr. Yomi Yinka.
Yeah, I can tell you straight away. I hope you can unmute so that we would hear his perspective. We're sparring mates when it comes to this whole question of where African knowledge is located. In fact, we published an interview with him where he shared his opinion. So if he's still around, you can just jump in and let's have your perspective on the question of knowledge production and consumption on the continent.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Dr. Yinka, okay, well, I think we'll probably jump over because I think he's there. But once again, immediately I saw the name as well. I had to quickly try to confirm from Doctor, you know. So he was the special advisor to Governor Abiola Ajimobi of Oyo State on communication and strategy. And I still remember him when the Ladoke Akintola University of Technology students came to the governor, and they had that very video that really refuses to go away. I know he gave an interview in the aftermath of that. I still recall that. So very quickly, let me go to Mr. Shalafayemi on this, PLIDE Shalafayemi, and then Kenny Okunuga. Can I lean on you the 1 or 2 minutes max, so that we can go to back to Dr. Odutola and we can end tonight's session? Shalafayemi, let's start with you. Or Kenny, whichever one of you can. We just have a few minutes. Okay. I'm thinking I'll have to jump over. Yeah. Oh, Kenny, yeah, it's okay. You can go first, but just because of our time, let's leave it with you. Yeah.
Thank you, the convener. My name is Kole Odutola, and I'm the DSP of PLIDE. I must say that today's webinar is quite enriching. And like the convener said, after now we still have to, go back to our libraries, and further read and study about all of these things that have been said. But that said, I want to raise about 3 questions. And number 1 is, I know that we have actually, these questions, have been discussed maybe spatially or, just on the head, but perhaps we can have, we can interrogate, deeper into them. One is, what are the primary barriers of knowledge production in Africa, and how can they be effectively addressed to enhance research and innovation? And in what ways do we think that, some of these African countries, okay, or let me say Black nations, including the Caribbean, in what ways can we leverage on digital technologies, to improve access to information and be able to disseminate, locally produced knowledge, producing our things that we can be able to sell to the world? And how does the level of investment in our education and research infrastructure, in our education system, impact the quality, and also the quantity of the knowledge that we produce on the African continent, and this time around in the Black nations of the world? And also, how do we think that, there's a perception. So how does the global perception and integration of the Black nations' knowledge production influence our local research agenda, maybe from, private organizations or from our government, and the consumption of this knowledge within our African space, within the Black space, and what initiatives and policies have proven effective in fostering collaborations within the Black nations of the world and knowledge sharing among, Black nations researchers and institutions, and how these can be scaled and replicated. Thank you, sir. And thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, PLIDE Kenny. And, and I'm going to go to Shalafayemi, and then we go back to Dr. Odutola. I don't know if you're like me, if you've been starstruck like me. I've been very starstruck. Basically just seeing quite a lot of people that I've admired from when I was little, or just heard their name and wondered who they were. So I'm going to bring in Shalafayemi now, and then we'll go to Dr. Odutola, and then we should be looking to end the session from there. Yeah. So just 1 minute, Shalafayemi, while I bring you on to join the panel. Okay, so yeah, let's hear from you.
Yes, my sincere thanks to Doctor, and also to the Pan-Africanists and fathers and mothers who have been so pathetic, and who also share the same plan for a better African continent. We want to sincerely appreciate you, and thank you for joining us this evening. My concern followed, the same line of thought as presented by the DSG. But however, we recently saw one video where one of the African countries hosted leaders from the whole world. And because of that, that particular nation that is also very poor in resources and human management purchased SUV of over 100 pieces, which were only meant to convey leaders from the airport to the conference and back to the airport. And after that, what happens to these the 100 SUVs that cost over $150 million with that country, a poor nation for that matter? And looking in that direction, it is also a pointer to how the Western world and even people in other African countries view us. They see our leaders as being unserious about governance. They see our leaders as being, wasting the resources that are meant to develop the human capital development in Africa. They also see us as a set of people who do not pay enough premium on the development of people, and particularly, the immense resources that God has blessed us with in Africa. It is not again saying that Africa is rich, Africa is prosperous, Africa is blessed. But the mismanagement of resources by our leaders is one of the bane of development in our continent. And when we are beginning to talk about production, we've understood over time, from even the economics perspective, that we cannot be a rich component, a rich, continent, until our export is greater than import. And it's quite unfortunate that most of the African nations depend so much, of bringing in raw materials, bringing in resources, bringing in materials from the Western world to develop our continent, when most of these things that we are even bringing from there were originally, taken away from us. So we need to change our thinking. I think we need to change our structural engineering. We need to look in depth, and if we must change anything in Africa, I feel it must change from leadership. Our leaders have a wrong perspective to organization. They have a wrong perspective to management. They don't address issues the way they are. And if many of us want to digress back into what we call Africa Union treaties, we have treaties on several, issues that has to do with development, that has to do with health. We have treaties on human resources. We have treaties on human rights. We have treaties on education and all of that. How many of our leaders are driving home this point? How are they complying with policies, with programs, with social functions and social engagement that will bring in the best of our people in Africa? Africa is blessed because, over time, I also look into scenario in which our African descendants will go from Africa to Western world and they become shining stars. What is now wrong? Where is the disconnection? If these guys were in Africa, they can also replicate whatever they are doing in the Western world in Africa. And why are we not harvesting the best brain all over the world for them to come back to Africa and develop the African continent? We are indirectly making ourselves, jesters. We are making ourselves laughing stock to the rest of it. So, sir, I want you to also look at how well can we develop Africa from the leadership perspective. How can our leaders be more responsive? How can they be more, attentive to issues that will bring in prosperity, and development to African continent? Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fayemi. So I want to appreciate everyone who's had a word or two to say on this. So as we go back to Dr. Kole Odutola, Doctor, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I was smiling all through while Brother Shola Fayemi was speaking, smiling because it is becoming more and more difficult to hold conversations about Africa without the pathologies, without corruption, without this. In sociology, they say if you keep on calling a person a dog, you probably will begin to see yourself as a dog. The West has not helped matters at all. They have focused, they are fixated, they're obsessed about all the wrong things about Africa. And Africans themselves have also started to focus on the symptoms rather than the disease itself. The question of leadership is a symptom of the kind of governance system that we borrowed, the legal system that we adopted, the educational system that is a colonial legacy. So for you, it is a question of leadership. But please, leadership is not only political leadership. There is moral leadership, there's spiritual leadership, there's family leadership. If you go back to the family and ask yourself, I always tell students, bring me one family where there is trust, and I will show you how prosperous they would be. But why is there no trust on the African continent? Why do families not like themselves? Because they all have to fight over the resources that are not even theirs. Well, I would advise that you create a whole new segment to do what the West loves to do. Trash Africa as long as you want, because I saw the passion in you. You were almost vibrating when you're talking about the evils of Africa. But I wish that you say the same thing about the goodness. Please go and research and let us begin to talk about the good things. You were sitting when you were our leaders at this, we're importing more than we can and stuff and all of that. Why have you sold yourself permanently to the West? Why? Who made you this? Who is to blame for this? There are good things, my brother, you can look into. The more we talk about those good things, we have just put on the table the Madden Charter, which is the first prototype of a constitution, of the way the citizens should behave. And it was in the 13th century, 50 years before the Magna Carta. So it is there for you to go and start to work with. We need to create a new set of people. It is not that we're not creating knowledge. One of the things somebody talked about barriers, Brother Kenny talked about barriers. Go and ask them in the academy, in the universities in Nigeria. Before you get promoted to the next level, you must have published in an international magazine. You cannot publish something that is relevant to the local condition in an international magazine unless you internationalize it. But you're not talking about that. You're not talking about what the hoops and hurdles our scholars have to go through to publish in international journals. How some of them are cheated. So, my brother, please, the convener is here. If you want me to appeal to him so that you can have a time to trash Africa as much as you want, I will do my best to get you to do it. And I hope you will feel very happy after you've done it. But for today, what I want to put and privilege is the question that we are producing, but it is not circulating. We're producing, but because of the divisions amongst us, the AU is there. I have not met any African that has shown any interest in AU. Before you start talking about the leadership, please, whatever it will cost, go into Afro perspectives and please look at what they've done already. Before you start talking about leadership, please listen to Professor Sylvia Tamalel from Uganda. When you have done that, let us come back and ask ourselves, when are we going to call MC Oluomo to a forum like this? Tell him what scholars have found out about motor parks and let him tell us what is happening there. Because we're elites, we don't know. Do you know how many people drive with charms in their waists? Why do they need charms to drive? Why do they need to drink paraga? People have done research on that. But do these local lackeys know what the elites have found out about them? The market women that still do a susu, how can it be digitized? My brother, there's too much on the plate for me to even, the leaders, look, there is something that we're developing called Nollywoodization. Nollywoodization is making creative productions where there is no government input. No government supported what the Nollywood producers were doing. Look at where they are today. After they have built it, Netflix comes and starts to reap from where the collective of us did. That is how we're going to grow Africa. I told you about McCall. He said, those of us outside do not understand what is going on inside. When we got inside to talk to them, they could not explain what they were doing, yet they were making impact. Please, there are many ways to get to where we're going. If we focus too much on what the West has done, their representation and their portrayal of us, we will keep using the rear mirror. We would always say, Egungun, be careful, now express you they go. The masquerade, be very careful. You're going on to the expressway. We must, as a people, go back. We need intergenerational conversations and dialogues. What our parents and our foreparents know. Let us start from there. Let us start to build our confidence. What is happening in the universities are so pathetic. Because how else? Somebody asked for local research that are relevant. But when you do a research that is relevant to the local, where are you going to publish it? And in what form and language are you going to publish it? So these are things that it looks as if it doesn't concern you, but what concerns you is the puppets we have. There have always been puppets all over the world as leaders, but once the people found out how to subvert the system, they would drive them out. But because the people we have, look, the disaggregation of our society, the motor parks that you call motor park touts, the market women, the artisans, the plumbers, the carpenters, we're not conscientizing them. We don't even talk to them. We talk down on them only when they cheat us. They do not cheat you because they are evil people. They cheat you because you're running an evil system. So I don't know where to start, but let me just focus myself. Knowledge is being produced on the African continent, and a lot of it, but it's not being codified in a way in which the West wants it. Thank you very much, Dr. Pasha. He says he has to go. But yeah, I know that we're running far behind time. But let me just leave it at that to say that we also need alternative spaces. Please, there are 2 assignments or 3. There is a video by Professor Sylvia Tamale. There is also Agenda 2063 that we need to look at. And there's also the Mandate Charter we need to look at ourselves. Now, this is not a presentation that I just want to talk. I want to leave us with actions. I want to make sure that we can do something ourselves and carry the light ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Tunde Owosheni.
Wow. I could actually sit there and listen all night long. Once again, I know you're tired of hearing it tonight, but you know, there's nothing that that appeals to a little boy more than meeting his heroes. You know, those he's always looked up to whilst growing up, seeing them face to face, being able to communicate to them. You probably wouldn't understand what impact your presence has made on someone like me tonight, but I do know, because I'm going to be writing this down, that tonight, you know, I had the pleasure of being in the same conference room, so to say, virtually, with all these distinguished personalities. Could you do a vote of thanks for us in just 1 minute, and then we close the session?
So yes, thank you so much, Doctor, for the response and for how well you've been able to open our eyes to the inherent opportunities and the large deposit of knowledge that we have in Africa. And like you said, sir, Africa is a rich and a prosperous nation. But we just have to look at how to explore, the rich knowledge base that Africa has been endowed with. There's no doubt. If we can tilt in the direction of your presentation today, I know that if we be here within the next 1 year to discuss Africa, we would have been 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 steps better than where we are currently. So in that vein, sir, I want to sincerely appreciate you for coming to this session this evening and for opening our eyes, and most especially for dissecting issues relating to knowledge production in Africa continent. And at the same time, I want to thank referred J. Everett Green and the wife, because I've been looking at him and his wife, being passionate, and the passion they've dissipated regarding Africa and issues regarding African knowledge. Sir, we sincerely want to appreciate you. We thank you and your wife for being part of this program today. And I know too, my convener, we also want to reach out to you because we always want to learn from headers. We would like to also at the time engage you on this platform to learn from your fountain of knowledge and to also see how best we can learn and use our insights to grow the continent and most especially the leadership in Africa. And sincerely, I want to thank Ibrahim also for being part of this session today. I sincerely, yes, I like your African outfit. Yes, it's actually showcasing, the inherent and beautiful culture we have in Africa. So most sincerely, we thank you for joining us this evening. And also to our leaders, the in-house leadership in PLIDE, who also joined us. We thank you so much for your time. We thank you for your insight and also for your contribution. To our social media audience on different platforms there, they also glued to us. We sincerely appreciate your consistent partnership in moving Nigeria and moving Africa forward. We thank everyone for being part of this session. God bless you all, and we wish you a fantastic new week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I took so copious notes. There's so much, but I know that, thank you so much, everyone. Once again, we've been with Dr. Kole Odutola of University of Florida, and we've had quite a few other very important guests in our midst. We've Professor Everett Green. You just need to go and read about him. The best way to introduce him is just to go and read a lot about him. He's a professor of philosophy. And then, of course, Dr. Pasha Agos was here with us, academic manager for international collaboration at the University of Florida. And of course, our own Ms. Khadija Ibrahim in the United Kingdom. You cannot be have knowledge of the arts in the United Kingdom and not have, have about that beautiful woman. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week. God bless you.
Thank you.